Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire, with your host, Steve Yates.
Welcome to the China Desk Podcast, episode 48. I'm your host, Steve Yates, Senior Fellow at the America First Policy Institute and Chair of the China Policy Initiative. A reminder to our audience, for whom we are most grateful, viewers can watch the China Desk on YouTube or subscribe to hear all our interviews on Apple, Spotify, and most other podcast providers. We welcome you to check out our website and show archive at ChinaDeskPodcast.com, and you can always access all our information at thefederalnewswire.com as well. My guest today is Leland Miller, co-founder and CEO of China Beige Book. China Beige Book International was founded in 2010 to help institutional investors and corporate CEOs navigate China's notoriously black box economy. Today, they operate the largest private in-country data collection network ever developed to track Chinese marketplace, gathering real-time economic data from thousands of firms across all of China's regions, sectors, and 34 discrete industries. They use a flagship platform that uses independent data and in-depth analysis on every key component of China's economy. Before co-founding the Beige Book in 2010, Leland was capital markets attorney based out of New York and Hong Kong and worked on deal team at major investment bank. Leland is an elected member of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations, an elected life member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a board member of the Global Interdependent Center, and non-resident senior fellow at the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council. Lee, I'm almost going out of breath with your resume, but not done yet. February 2024, Leland was appointed commissioner to the congressionally mandated U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission by Speaker of the House Mike Johnson for a term expiring in December 2025. So now with that, Lee, welcome to the China Desk. Let's jump in.
Steve, thanks for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you on. I've been looking forward to this conversation for some time. Transparency to the audience, I have known Lee for many years and am very fond of his analytical abilities and focus on especially this area of the Chinese economy, because one of the longest term challenges I think that we have faced in government, media, and generally in society is how to get to the ground truth about what's happening in China's economy. And the project you launched, I think, makes a unique contribution to it. But before we get to the China Beige Book, let's talk about Lee Miller. When you were growing up and you were in elementary school and they said, hey, what do you want to do when you grow up? Do you say, I want to put out a comprehensive study on China's economy?
That is not what I said, but it was a road to get there. There's no question. What I grew up in D.C., so I had the bug like everybody else. I wanted to do something in policy. I wanted to do something in foreign policy. And it was just at the time I was going through high school, and the Soviet threat had just ended. The Soviet Union just blew up. Japan was all the rage, but I didn't believe that was going to be a long-term issue for the United States. I was looking over at the horizon at that point, and what I saw was China. And it's a little bit hard to imagine the China that we saw in the 1990s is now the China that we see in the 2020s. But I thought that was going to be the next big threat. And so, or challenge at that point. And so I think that what I had tried to do going forward from high school on is get a grounding on the Hill, spent a lot of time on the Hill and internships. And then when I got to college, took Mandarin. Got absolutely massacred in my Mandarin classes in college. Everybody was Taiwanese and already spoke the language, so I was just getting crushed. But grinded it out. Went to Taiwan afterwards. Did language immersion in Taiwan. Afterwards, went to graduate school. Got my master's in Chinese history, and then went to law school. And so I spent 3 years in law school and then became an attorney. And I think that the question at that point was, how long can I continue down this road? I was working on capital markets deals, in Hong Kong and in southern China. And so, I had China, I didn't drop China at all, but the question was, how much can I keep my foot in the door of China policy at the same time as becoming a lawyer? So I lasted as long as I could. And then eventually, sprung out and started China Beige Book.
And so, when did the spring begin? You had, so you were a very happy attorney and,
Yeah.
and life was moving along. Think somewhere along the lines you met someone that mattered to you, and you decided, nah, this China thing, this pull is just too strong. So when did the China stuff start pulling you back in?
Well, I had kept my foot in the door. I mean, I was speaking at think tanks, mostly on Chinese military matters, because there weren't a lot of conference or events related to the Chinese economy, and just keeping my foot in the door while an attorney billing 3,000 hours a year, suffering. We knew each other back then. You knew how much I was suffering, but what was fun to me is trying to make sure that I kept in the China world as much as I could. And one of the things that I did was I was doing some buy-side advisory on the side. I don't know why they let me do it. They wouldn't let me do it if it was 2020, 2024, but they let me do it back then. So I was doing buy-side advisory on the Chinese economy. And I kept going into meetings and hearing these questions. They were outlandish and based on official data and overly focused on GDP and nonsensical Chinese pronouncements and statistics. And finally, I just burst out and said, these are all the wrong questions. You're asking the wrong questions. And somebody came out to me and said, well, smart guy, why don't you do something better? So obviously that meeting went terribly. But it did spark something. And I went back and said, look, if I could do anything I wanted to do on the ground in China, what would that be? How would I do it? And that started a sort of multi-year exercise in which I work with a handful of people to sort of think through how creating good data from China would work. And we were the China Beige Book. We started with a Federal Reserve Beige Book methodology, but that's mostly qualitative. We've decided within the first year, it took us 2 years or so to put this together. Within the first year, we were doing quantitative and qualitative work. We realized, look, the United States, the qualitative stuff is important because you got so many quantitative measurements. In China, there's no quantitative data. So we realized, forget this qualitative stuff. It's nice flavoring, but it's not the important stuff that everybody wants. Just build up the quantitative side. And everybody in the world told us we couldn't do it. We'd never be able to get data out of China. It's a black box economy. These are Chinese communists. We did it. It worked. We did it more. We asked more questions. And it was really remarkable how much we were able to build this up year after year after year.
Well, let's go to a little bit of the prequel to that. So you're familiar with a lot of people in the China policy community and basically what people had been debating and what the basis of those conversations had been. For a long time, there had been people writing about the Chinese economy, the reform and opening period. They would talk about kind of pronouncements by the central government. There might be a focus on a province or a city here or there. The World Bank was one of the key places people would go to try to find some form of aggregated data or forecasting. But at least in my experience and to my mind, a lot of people were doing what we would call using the force. They would get a piece of things here or there, and they would extrapolate a great deal. And there wasn't a lot of intellectual inquiry into what's the foundation for this report? What's the foundation for this data set? And so really, for the first few decades of the U.S. experiment on U.S.-China economic policy, we were flying more blind than people really knew, and maybe aspirationally, if not blind. So talk a little bit about what the precursors were. Mm-hmm. It wasn't just your meeting. This is what the U.S. Congress was flying with in terms of making decisions about entry to the WTO or permanent normal trade or not. This is what the executive branch was going with in terms of trying to get a sense of what were good deals or bad deals. But talk a little bit about exactly how tenuous or bad was some of this analysis, even among some famous investment houses and universities.
Well, the information was bad. The data were bad. But the key thing here is it was bad intentionally. Yeah. Everybody was incentivized to talk up the China story. Why? Because investment banks who were writing a lot of this research wanted to sell China. They wanted to sell Chinese assets. They wanted to sell access into China. Corporates wanted to get into China. In order to do that, they had to make the government happy. The idea of consumption. I don't know how many times we heard back in the day, well, look, there's a billion Chinese. If they all buy 2 eggs, you sell 2 billion eggs. How could you not have a successful business when everything is in the billions? So there was an enormous incentive by the people who were doing China analysis to pump up the story. And there was even more incentive not to tell anything about the warts, the downside of the story, because you saw Beijing in one eye looking. And if you got Beijing mad, then they might, not approve your project. They might, restrict your access. They might throw you in a gulag. And so, you had to be very nice to the Chinese government, in addition to talking this overly positive story. Not that there were not, positive stories to tell about a China that was growing at the speed it was growing, but what we were not getting was honest analysis. And the way this used to work back in the day was that China would always predict its GDP ahead of time, and it would always hit its target. And until very recently, that was the dynamic for China. GDP was always forecasted beforehand. And if you knew where to look, certain think tanks, certain monetary policy advisors, they would leak out the government stuff. They would announce it. These investment banks knew who to talk to. They would announce it and say, okay, China's going to grow 8%. China announced 8% at the end of that quarter. Everyone walked around high-fiving each other as if analysis was being done. There was no analysis. It was a complete conspiracy in terms of putting together the China story. So for years and years and years, corporates were getting the wrong story. Retail investors were getting the wrong story. Politicians, policymakers were getting the wrong story. And it wasn't until fairly recently that people said, well, wait a second. What we're seeing just doesn't dovetail with the nonsense that's coming out of the average Goldman or JP Morgan or other investment reports. This is a different China. So I think people have been opening their eyes in the last several years, but this was a decade or two too late.
Yeah, well, you hit on a couple of things that I'd like to dive deeper into. Obviously, we're dealing with a very different China today than in the 2000s. Much less the 1990s and before. And again, it's not that there weren't warts and there weren't some positives and some negatives all along the way, but there's something fundamentally different now. And somewhere the memo seemed to go out to get people to either hit the panic button or rethink button in some magnitude. But getting at just the data, based on what you were describing, talk a little bit about what the Beige Book is and how you're able to pull together this data, and how, given all that you've said, you didn't get zapped the way that others said that they might or feared. But you've actually proven that some people not only can handle the truth, but they might actually pay for the truth and operate under it.
Well, when we started China Beige Book, what we decided that we wanted to do was tell a story about all the Chinas, not just what's happening at state enterprises, large state enterprises in Beijing, and not through the government lens. We wanted to tell an independent story from the ground up, and we wanted to talk about all the different Chinas, all the smaller cities up to the bigger cities, the private firms, state-owned enterprises, large firms, small firms, et cetera. And so we did this through survey. And, we asked, back then, and it was, 1,200 firms a quarter. Everyone said that was too big. It was triple the size of the PMI. When we surveyed it, it couldn't be done. Now we're at tens of thousands of firms that we're surveying. It's gotten much bigger. It's monthly. We have data that comes out on a daily basis. Essentially, it's real time. It's a different story. But the idea behind it was we wanted it to look across all of China's important sectors, all of China's key regions, make sure that this was an all China survey, and then contrast what was happening in the different parts of China. And we didn't want to just get a number. So China's 6.8% GDP growth. China's a 51.2 PMI. What does that tell anybody? Even people who track these data usually can't tell you, whether a 50.6 on the PMI to a 51.2 down to a 50.8 is a positive story. Nobody really knows this. These are just individual numbers. We wanted to put out a lot of different metrics that told the story. And we wanted to not just talk about growth, because underpinning everything in China is credit. And so we were the first and only firm in the world, the only people other than the People's Bank of China who track credit conditions on the ground in China. So we were tracking who was borrowing, how much are they paying for their loans? Are they issuing bonds? What sectors have access to capital? What are they borrowing for? Are they getting rejected by banks? Have loan applications spiked? What's pent up demand? So looking at credit, looking at shadow finance, which was a huge part of the credit financial system that nobody had any visibility into. Looking at the labor market. Looking at inflation. We wanted to get a story of all these things and then put it together through our analysis to say, here's what's happening in China. It's not all positive. It's not all negative. It's a nuanced story, but you can tell what's happening underneath the hood by actually getting granular data from the ground up and creating a story that explains what firms are doing and what the government's doing and what the growth trajectory looks like.
So to get at the sort of either skeptic or critic or conspiracy theorist angle on this, why have you been able to get away with this investigation into the truth? Aren't communist parties against being able to open up and show what's going on? After all, one of the big kicks at dealing with China and our dealings with China is that they are this black box. They don't allow for transparency and accountability. But your model is suggesting you're at least approximating that with your survey. How have you been able to get away with that?
Well, you never know the full story, but I mean there are red lines that are very sensitive. We stay away from very sensitive sectors. We stay away from very specific questions. For instance, when we first started, we were toying around with the idea of asking firms, whether they had non-performing loans. We did it one time, and we asked a question, are there too many non-performing loans in China? Yeah. So there's a huge systemic problem. Yeah. Does your bank have any? No. And so you realize certain questions won't get you answers. Certain questions have red lines. We don't sell into China. We don't put out a Chinese version. I think that's a big thing. But I think the major reason that we're still around today is that we proved very early on that we're out there calling balls and strikes. Regardless of what we think, we've got a lot of different people, a lot of different views inside China Beige Book. We're there to call balls and strikes in the economy. And one of the early, big victories for us that really put us on the map was in 2015. The world thought there was a hard landing going on. There was stock market collapsed. There was a really bad PMI. There was something that people had thought was a currency devaluation. It was sort of one strike, two strike, three strikes. Markets fell dramatically. I mean, commodities and some of the A-share stocks fell 20, 30%. Everybody was panicked on China. And we came out and said, actually, this is probably the best time to buy in 5 years. There's nothing going on that was any different than a quarter ago. We're looking at this. Yes, you had a bad manufacturing PMI, but the service sector was strong. Yes, you had what people thought was a currency intervention, but that's not what it was. And, the stock market's not related to the real economy. And so actually right now, China has the entire hard landing thing is nonsense. We've been out there when people were way too pessimistic. And we've been out there when people are way too optimistic. So we're not trying to be bears or bulls. We're trying to get the growth story right at all times. And I think we've proven that over and over. Back in 2015, there was about a 6-week stint in which nobody would go on TV and articulate what they thought was going on in China because they thought they'd be wrong. I mean, we talked to a competitor in a CNBC green room, and they said that they told the producer that they wouldn't talk about certain things like what's happening in China. They'd only talk about, U.S.-China policy. And I said, I'll go out there. I'm going to tell them exactly what's happening. They're like, yeah, you can do that because you've got data. We think you're right. We've read your stuff. But if we're wrong, then this is the end of us. Whereas, we can't risk it. So we said, we can risk it. We're not guessing. We have data. This is the story. And so we tell the story as it transpires.
Well, it certainly has held up over time in terms of a line of analysis. And I think now, after several years, there's probably the arc of a few stories that you can tell unlike other people. So with that sort of invitation and challenge, talk a little bit about what you see as some of the key trend lines in China's economic story, but also in terms of the lens outsiders have tried to bring into it. What are the key lines of that have been most right or most wrong. You've alluded to a key moment in time in that 2015 window.
Mhm.
We've got the before Xi Jinping and after Xi
Mhm.
Jinping timelines, and some things have really changed, but
Mhm.
not all of it is policy. COVID affected a lot of different things, but maybe the economic fundamentals in China weren't as
Mhm.
impacted by that as the rest of the world was. But talk a little bit about what some of the big analytical things were inside China, but also how outsiders might not be seeing the whole picture.
Well, here's a big one. China's economic growth model, as we know it, ended around 2020. It was for years, as China watchers, as China economy watchers, we were taught that the Chinese Communist Party works in very specific ways. They want to have high levels of growth. They won't tolerate weakness. If they see weakness in the data, then they're going to go big on stimulus to get it up. If the stimulus doesn't work, they're going to lie about the data. Party Congress years are huge stock market rally years. They really care about these numbers, and they care about the stock market, and they care about all these other things, and none of that's true anymore. So what happened at around 2020, 21, and people saw this beginning with the Common Prosperity campaign, and they saw this with the tech crackdown on giants like Alibaba, Tencent. Uh, China decided that they did not want to continue this growth model anymore. It didn't just end. Xi Jinping looked at this and said, unlike Western politicians who can do whatever they want for the 2 years or 4 years or 8 years they're in and then pass it off to the next guy, we're the Chinese Communist Party. We want to be here for 50, 100 years. So what we have to do is make sure we're not having any of these vulnerabilities creep up on us. And the number one vulnerability that was creeping up on them was big debt. So you saw a massive change in credit and stimulus policy starting around 2021. And you saw it earlier, but you really started to see it in 20 and 2021. And it was amazing because, this was during COVID, and we were doing a lot of, online panels with, the investment banks on our left and right. And every one of them, with very few exceptions, were saying, double down. The Chinese stock market's going to have a roaring rally. Xi Jinping can't stand this pain point. It's going to hit his pain point, and then he's going to reverse course. Just watch. This is how China's economy worked. And we said, no, it doesn't. We're looking at credit flows right now. We're looking at borrowing patterns right now. They have changed the way they're governing the economy. They're not worried about high levels of growth anymore. The stimulus playbook is completely veered off course from where it was. They're not worried about weak data. They want to make sure there's not a doom loop of confidence. So there's a lot of worry about the housing sector and how much credit went into it. It just this black hole swallowed up credit because it was producing these ghost cities and other things. Well, they wanted to step in and stop that and diminish the property sector as a growth driver in the economy. But what they did is, they stepped in and they really tightened credit. But at a certain point, they would have to ease conditions a little bit to make sure everyone didn't. 70% of household assets in China roughly are in property, so they wanted to make sure that they weren't going to spread contagion from property outside into the broader economy. So every once in a while, that they'd they'd ventilate the system. We used to call it, cull the herd, ventilate the property sector than the broader economy. Every time there was just a little bit of easing up, every one of our friends at Wall Street would say, oh, this is it. Double down, stimulus, this is it. Xi Jinping's given up. He finally hit his pain point. He said, no, he did. They're stepping in. Sure enough, a month later, tighten conditions again. It's because Xi is worried about the trajectory of China's economy based on throwing unlimited amounts of credit at the problem. So they've completely changed the way they are governing. And this is why I keep getting questions right now. When is the time with these wonderful valuations of these A-share stocks that have been depressed for 2, 5, 10 years? When's a good time to buy? Well, Xi Jinping doesn't care about investor returns. There may never be a good time to buy. He doesn't care about the stock market. He doesn't care about high levels of growth anymore, the GDP target notwithstanding. And he doesn't care about stimulating into weakness. And so the real issue here is that the economy doesn't work the way it used to. And we could see that very clearly in the data. But Wall Street banks that didn't have data, that don't have data, and that were highly incentivized to sell the China story, were continuing to lead people off a cliff. And, the second part of this, of course, and I don't want to drone on too long, but the second part of this is policymakers. Policymakers were listening to these investment bankers. So not only did you have the U.S. economy and U.S. corporates and others completely driven in the wrong direction, you had policymakers thinking there was a reality that there really wasn't. So it's been a mess for a number of years now, but people have to realize China's economic growth model, the paradigm has completely changed. What keeps Xi Jinping up at night right now is not worries about growth. It's worries about national security. It's building up a domestic chip ecosystem. It's worries about the vulnerabilities to the U.S. dollar and the U.S. dollar payment systems. That's what he wants to try to affect at the margins. He doesn't care about levels of growth, and he certainly doesn't care about foreign investor returns.
Well, certainly performance over his tenure in office would bear that thesis out. I mean, that's basically, you can talk about the data that's from the ground up, the data that's coming out of the leadership is bearing the trend out that you're describing too. When I sit back and look at this too, I guess a couple of questions really come to mind. What is sustainable in the Chinese model in this current interpretation, and what is less sustainable than the leadership might think in this different approach? Because you've outlined a model where Xi's thinking is different and China's direction is different. That seems to be borne out by facts. But you haven't said his anxiety's gone away, or even that it's well managed. He could still be very concerned about a number of different things right now. So the story you're telling isn't that all is well in China. It's just that these pieces of this puzzle that we thought were permanent and, immutable, aren't what they once were. That's changed, but the anxiety's there. It's just a different placement for that anxiety. Do I have that right?
No, you have it exactly right. And I think let me answer your question about sustainability, because I have a completely different take than most of my friends who are China bears and who I do a lot of panels with. China is not going to collapse. It's not going to collapse. And the reason it's not going to ever collapse is because it's a non-commercial financial system. A lot of people looked at what happened in the West and Europe and the United States and said, well, it's only a matter of time before China gets its comeuppance because of debt. But China's economic system doesn't work the same as what the West does. It's a non-commercial financial system, which means that it can swoosh huge waves of capital from one side of the system to the other in order to plug gaps. You can have state-owned enterprises bail out other state-owned enterprises. You can have private, you can have different parts of the economy bail out other parts of the economy. You can use the capital within the system to plug holes that are occurring as they happen, which means there is much less vulnerability to a collapse. There is not going to be a Lehman collapse in China. But what's the downside to that? There's a huge downside to that. It's that the more you do this, the more you throw good money after bad, the more you continue to build up the bad debt and bail out these entities, which should be allowed to fail, but are never allowed to fail in China, or rarely allowed to fail in China. You see one every couple of years of the big ones, the gray rhinos go down. But the more that you put good money after bad, the more that you chase capital to non-productive uses, the more you're guaranteeing the economy slows more and more. Because you're not putting capital towards productive uses, you're putting it towards non-productive uses like bailing out bad debt and continue to keep these zombies afloat. So what happens? China's not going to collapse. At least it won't collapse under any normal scenario. But it will. The problem is it's going to continue to slow and slow and slow. And what China can look at between the debt situation, the way it runs its economy, and the demographics is an economy that runs at very, very low levels of growth into the future. It's sustainable. It's doable. But I think if you look at what Xi Jinping is doing right now, he's governing with that recognition in mind. He's telling the Chinese people to eat bitter. He's telling them that they need to be focusing not on, consumer electronics. We need to be putting our capital towards hardcore advanced tech that will help us from a national security perspective. We're not focusing on property more. There's not enough capital to go around. If you look at what policy is, if you look at what the pronouncements are actually saying, she is acknowledging everything I'm saying. Everything in China Beige Book data makes sense with what the Chinese Communist Party is currently articulating. It's just not what a lot of foreign investors want to hear, and so they don't want to listen.
Mm-hmm. Well, with that awesome pivot point, let's move into policy more than analysis. You're on a commission that does a bit of this policy analysis, and I know that it's a part of your brain also. And so let's talk a little bit about what American policy towards China has been. especially in this economic area. What do you see as kind of the key moving parts there? We've had debates about tariffs as tools. Those seem to be as permanent a part of the lexicon as anything is ever permanent. They seem to have been tried, and there's a bipartisan base of interest and support in continuing that in some measure. There's been a dialogue about strategic decoupling or de-risking or balancing, safe shoring, onshoring. I'm sure there's moving parts to this that aren't coming immediately to mind. So correct what you see as some of the bigger pieces of this. But when you think of it as a policymaker, putting that hat on, where do you see the big areas that we need to swing and hit? And what are the big areas where we've been swinging and missing?
Big question. But let me start off by saying that I wear a number of hats. One of them is commissioner on the U.S.-China Economic and Security Review Commission. Nothing I say today reflects anything else. It's not the commission's view. It's not my colleague's view. It's just me talking. So let me get that out of the way up front. Look, when the policy, you hear policy talk about decoupling, but I think the problem with the entire idea of decoupling is it means whatever anybody wants it to mean. You know, deglobalization and decoupling and de-risking are sort of lumped in as the same type of term. What smart policy should be doing right now is understanding you're not going to be able to cut off the links between the United States and China overnight. Even if you absolutely wanted to, you have enormous supply chain vulnerabilities right now. For instance, we have no idea, looking at pharmaceutical inputs, how much of the inputs to penicillin and other types of very important medications are produced in China that could be cut off in some problems. So we don't have visibility in this. We need visibility into it. But the idea that we're going to wake up one day and the economies are going to be separated completely, it's not going to happen. But what we need to be more cognizant of is that there are issues in which for years and years and years, United States policy has either been unserious or it has been actively helping the Chinese economy rise, the Chinese technology sectors get better and better, and the Chinese military become a peer competitor with the United States, a peer challenge the United States. And so what's happening? You have a situation where China doesn't work on normal free trade policies. And so you've had uneven trade for many, many years. That can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. But if you look at what Xi Jinping is saying right now, he's talking about new productive forces. I mean, this is 2024, but this is sort of what he's been doing all along. They want to produce and they want to export to the world and they want to gobble up markets. And that's what they're going to do. That there's a threat to industries in the United States and Europe and elsewhere from this, and so we need to have a better grasp of the problems related to trade that we have vulnerabilities on, and have a sound trade policy that doesn't leave us vulnerable on that. If you look at technology, we are fueling the rise of China's technological rise as a technological superpower. What's been happening for the last 15, 20 years is China's either been stealing technology or it's been getting ready access to Western technology that'll allow it to become a leader in what Xi Jinping calls the fourth industrial revolution, which is he laid this out. It's the Made in China 2025 program, which never went away. It's what is going to create leadership for the world, commercial leadership of the world and military leadership for the world for the next 15, 20, 30, 50 years, which is artificial intelligence, quantum, biotech, robotics, 5G, et cetera. All these key components are technologies that we have up until very recently allowed the Chinese to get unimpeded. We've assisted them with them. We've invested there. And I think the last thing is there's an enormous amount of capital that's going into China right now, some of which we know about, some of it's direct investment, some of it is just enormous amounts of portfolio investment, which may go through third parties. It's obscured. So I think there's a lot of things we need to get right. We got to fix our supply chains. We need to fix our defense industrial base so that it's able to deter some of these worst case contingencies. But it's trade, it's technology investment. What do we need to do to have smart policies that guard us from a national security perspective? So stop looking at it from the economic perspective. There will still be commercial relations to the U.S. and China. But what do we need to do in order to make sure that we're operating smartly on the national security side? And if we're doing that, then we can dictate what parts of the economic relationship will have to change and what can stay the same.
Well, so when you look at those things, I've been kind of using a framework of what have we been doing by way of policy that has allowed for privileged access to markets, technologies, opportunities to go? And what can we do now to throttle that back so that we're being more deliberate about to whom we give this privilege of access to technology and opportunity and information? And you can do that across the board in the U.S. government and in the private sector as well. And then the other issue is dependency. I don't think that you would get any pushback from our audience about the need for gradualism. After all, we dug this hole for more than 50 years. We don't have to go back that many decades, and China was not dominant in key supply chains. We did this, and we can shift it. It won't be free and it won't be instant, but the question is strategic direction. And so what are we doing by way of policy to be less dependent and maybe diversifying those supply chains if we aren't looking at complete onshoring in certain instances? But it's more the strategic direction. And then I think a revitalization of that kind of collaboration across alliances, maybe even taking a fresh look in our own hemisphere, are areas of opportunity for this conversation that don't have to be us versus them, but what are we doing to be more deliberate about these decision-making processes, fed with the reality of the data you're talking about and that you specialized in, but also the experience that we've had over the last 30 years, informing where do we aim to go now, and also to recognize China's going to have a say in some of this. I mean, Xi Jinping's been talking about strategic decoupling from a Chinese point of view for the better part of a decade. And sometimes when they say things over and over, we might want to believe it. And so if they want to have their brands and to control markets, well, our choice is whether and how we're going to respond and with whom. So to me, that is a rich set of challenges that are not all dark. It just means that we've got to be a little bit more mindful in our decisions, and we've got opportunities in all of this. So any of that strike you as off the mark, or is within range for where we ought to be thinking and going over coming years?
No, I think it's exactly right. And, a lot of these positions used to be considered very hawkish, very out of the mainstream, and now less so. And it's not just because there's an anti-China fever in DC. I think what there is a recognition that if we are to coexist with China, that we need to prioritize things that are in America's national security interest and get those right. And then we can have other parts of the relationship where we remain engaged with them, and we still trade, we still interact, we still cooperate in certain ways. We have to make sure that we've got a priority set, a very small priority set that we work from, and say, look, it's really important we get trade right. It's really important we get advanced technology right. It's really important that the investment from U.S. entities or U.S. pensioners are going to help the Chinese military, the Chinese Communist Party, build a war machine that's going to end up killing American soldiers in the Pacific. We have to make sure we get these type of things right. We get the supply chains figured out so that we're less susceptible to meltdowns as we saw during COVID. And we get the defense industrial base part right. These are the things that if we just prioritize them, this doesn't mean that we go to war with China. I think the opposite happens. It means that we have a smarter, more secure standpoint where we get these 5 things right, and maybe a few others people would add to the list, and then we're not throwing 100 pieces of weird anti-China stuff against the wall. Then we can have responsible policy, and it can be done thoughtfully instead of everyone trying to figure out what the most hawkish China policy is and advocating for that. We need some thoughtful, integrated policy. We need to do with our allies, and we need to have it laid out fairly soon. So that we could get our house in order before there's a potential, negative scenario in the Taiwan Strait.
Well, I'm all for hawkish. I think it's thoughtful, but I get what you're saying, and the audience will know that was a gratuitous cheap shot on my part. But looking at one of the big topics that we've covered in all of our conversations that we could work it into is the concept of reciprocity. And I think it gets into the realm you were talking about, where we're not talking about being anti-China in any form or fashion, but there has been this loosey-goosey approach to engagement with China and China's engagement in the United States, where they've been able to have access in our country where we don't have access in theirs. That there was a set of rules that were in some ways more permissible for the Chinese Communist Party and its related entities than is the case for others in our own markets and systems. And so we've been an advocate for trying to apply this principle, not as an on-off switch, but as a guide for, what they don't grant our companies and government access to in their realm. We should be given a long, hard thought to whether they should be allowed to do the same in our own system. But what say you about the role or efficacy of this concept of reciprocity and thinking through how the United States and China interact?
Well, I think we need it. And the reason we didn't have it before is that there was this belief that China was this smaller, not important economy that would never be a peer competitor of the United States. It would never be a true military challenger of the United States. It would certainly never be a technological peer of the United States. And so, look, if we can get cheap T-shirts and we can get some other things out of it, that it's probably worthwhile because we're not worried about the China threat. Now we have to consider China from a whole bunch of different dimensions. We have to worry about as a commercial competitor, a military challenge. We have to worry about an economic challenge. This is why we're worried about how we are going to deal with the threat of some of these sectors, these advanced technology sectors that China wants to produce a ton of and export like crazy in the United States. China's markets have been closed off. Once they incubate these industries, they open them up, but they've always been closed off. We can't get our firms in there in order to do the same things. Our tech firms aren't able to operate in China. So it's about access and it's about markets, and this has not been the case for a while. People have been willing to overlook that. But I think right now we have to go down the list and say, this is where we should be receiving reciprocity. And if we don't get that, then there'll be a price to be paid.
Well, as we shift into more of the final thoughts category, Lee, I'd like to draw you out to look over the horizon a bit and say what you're most optimistic about in terms of the people and leadership of the United States meeting this challenge and maybe adopting some of the themes and ideas you've been advocating, and maybe where your key concerns are for countervailing trends that give you pause about our ability over the next, say, 5+ years to rise to and overcome this challenge.
Yeah. So, I mean, the optimistic part is that, the United States has shown over and over that when it understands the challenge, it is usually willing to rise up and meet it. It just takes Americans a long time to acknowledge that there is a real problem here and that they need to get on top of it. So I think that process has started. I don't think it's fast enough. I don't think it's serious enough, but it has started. What worries me is that people will look at China right now, and even some of the things that I'm saying about a slowing economy, and not take the China threat seriously enough. One of the reasons that a lot of my friends would get mad at me is they say, "Stop talking about slowing China. You're diminishing it as a threat. You're diminishing it as something we need to be serious about." And I said, no, that's absolutely not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, if the economy is slowing and you're not going to have high levels of growth, the old economic growth model is dead. But what Xi Jinping is focused on are these Made in China 2025 sectors. And what an authoritarian centralized government is really good at doing is marshaling resources to do a handful of things really, really, really intensively. So they are going to throw enormous amounts of capital at semiconductors, AI, quantum, biotech, all these really important technology sectors for the future. And if we don't take that seriously, they're going to wipe the floor with us. So we have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that even though China is a slowing economy, it's not the same type of competitor, the same type of threat it was before. It's much more serious worry for us in these areas of technology. And of course, in the Pacific. I mean, what's happening in the Pacific right now is worrisome for anyone. I thought that, the Chinese have held out hope that if they just get the right guy in as president, one party or another, then they're going to be able to make a deal, and they're going to make their problems go away, and they're going to be able to revert to the past. And what I think that Beijing is understanding now is that it doesn't matter whether it's Republicans or Democrats. It'll be different policies, but nobody's going to revert to the old ways. And so I think that this has hardened the Chinese approach, and they're sort of doubling down on building up their war machine to get ready for a contingency. I hope Americans have the same seriousness about the threat out there, because I think that if they don't, then we're going to be marching ourselves into a real problem by the end of the decade.
Well, it's a conversation we definitely need to have here in the United States in a serious way, and one we need to have with our allies in a serious way. And at least in my recent travels to other parts of East Asia, in Japan, Korea, and elsewhere, it seems like they're aware of some of these trends. They're concerned about these things and the seriousness of U.S. response, but an openness that there's kind of a new normal out there, and they've got to do some adjusting too. I think that's good for the United States and maybe healthier for our alliances and the situation that could maybe put some guardrails on the malign influences of the CCP going forward. But we shall see. But before we go, Lee, if folks want to follow your work and your commentary, what are the places you would point them to keep track?
Well, China Beige Book has a Twitter feed that we try to keep very provocative. We made a decision a number of years ago that we were not just going to put out reports. We were going to call people out when they did dumb policy. We were going to call people out when they said stupid things. We continue to do that aggressively. So at China Beige Book on Twitter is one way to do it. We put out our media on our website, ChinaBeigeBook.com, and we're on LinkedIn and some other things. So we make sure that all the media we do gets sifted through, because we want to be part of the conversation, and we want to serve as a corrective to some of these other entities out there who are perhaps not telling the full story on China. But I'd say Twitter's the best way, at China Beige Book.
Well, excellent. We certainly encourage the audience to check you out and to follow the analysis and commentary. Very important part of the conversation. It's a pleasure to talk with you, Lee, personally and professionally. Glad you were able to join us for the episode. For our audience, if you enjoyed today's China Desk conversation, please tell your friends, consider subscribing, and give a visit to ChinaDeskPodcast.com. Thank you for joining us. Special thank you to Leland Miller for sharing his perspective. Until next time, I'm Steve Yates, your host here at the China Desk.
Thank you for listening to the China Desk podcast, presented by the Federal Newswire and hosted by Steve Yates. Check out the Federal Newswire's family of websites, as well as their social media stream.